In the novel Darkness in the Blood, we learn about an entity called the Black Angel. Where the Sanguiner is the embodiment of Sanguinious' honour, the Black Angel is a manifestation of his and his son's flaws. Every time a Blood Angel succumbs to the Black Rage, the Black Angel grows in strength. I found this idea of a Black Rage warp entity extremely compelling, so when Games Workshop sent me the new Nightbringer miniature, I knew exactly what to do with it. The basic structure of the Nightbringer was an ideal way to represent the Black Angel. The Grim Reaper-inspired aesthetic and long flowing robes would form an excellent base for this dark reflection of Sanguinious. When it came to tackling this build, I decided to do things a little backwards. The instructions suggest building the torso first, but I instead opted to build the lower half and work my way up. So I began a few pages in and clipped away all the parts required to build the lower half. My first modification came in the removal of the very angular, almost pixelated edge of the robes. This works great for Necrons, but less so for the Blood Angels, so I set to work with my clippers and knife. These were used to cut down and trim the hard corners and edges to create more of a ragged fabric appearance. This was quite a long process as there were lots of edges to fix, but once I was happy, I assembled the lower half of the Nightbringer model together. In addition to the blocky edges, there were also a number of circuit board-like indentations dotted across the robes. Again, these didn't quite fit the style I was going for, so needed to be filled in. For this task, I used some AK putty. It's water-soluble, so can be applied across the surface and wiped down to leave those indentations filled in. Once the putty had been allowed to cure, I could use my knife, files and fine grit sandpaper to smooth out the surfaces and remove any excess cured putty. And once my surfaces were prepped, I could add the lightning bolts, without the scarab swarms of course, and glue the model to its base. Now that I had a good place to build up from, I could add the basic torso pieces to the lower part of the body, which gave me a much better idea of how to tackle my next step. To put the Angel in Black Angel, I needed wings, and this ideal pair were sourced from the Bretonnian Royal Pegasus kit. But before I could attach them, I first had to do a little more cutting. This was mainly to remove Meridia's beacon from the Nightbringer's back, but also to ensure that there was a flat enough surface on the wings mounting points. Once I was happy with both, I then set about creating some pins to help hold the wings in place. I drilled into both the torso and the wings, superglued my steel wire and clipped it down to length. Here I made a final test fit to ensure I was happy with how the wings looked in relation to the rest of the torso, before locking them in place with a little more glue. With the wings attached, I had caused a little intersection problem with some of the pieces of the fabric that the Nightbringer is swathed in. I still wanted to add this though, so the clippers and knife were broken out again as I gradually made indentations where necessary until the cloth pieces could fit alongside the wings. The trick here is to make small trims and frequent comparisons until things can fit together neatly. But before we go any further with my Black Angel, let's first take a moment to discuss what is the bane of any wargamer? Storing and transporting your lovingly built and painted miniatures in a way that isn't just letting them rattle around loose inside a Tupperware container. And as you recoil in horror at that idea, I have genuinely seen this occur on several occasions at tournaments. But fortunately, for the more sensible-minded among us, there is Tabletop Stronghold, the sponsors of this video. This is the Mag Case 2.0. As the name suggests, it's a magnetic carrying case that also doubles up as a nice display case thanks to this clear perspex window here. And mounted safely inside are my Raptors. Many of you have been asking to see these all together, so voila, here they all are. They've been mounted to the steel trays that make up the interior of the case, and they can be easily moved around to create different heights between the shelves. Meaning I can have my taller jump pack intercessors on one row, my Land Raider on another, and my slightly shorter infantry units on the rest. The shelves also slide all the way out, and after gluing the provided magnets to their bases, the miniatures remain securely in place. I also find these particular pull-out trays to be really helpful when you're packing up, deploying, or moving between tables when you're at a tournament. The case itself comes in flat pack form and is incredibly simple to build. I managed to do it without even looking at the instructions, although that's pretty much par for the course when it comes to my building of things. The outside of the case is constructed from laser-cut MDF, and it is incredibly sturdy when built. Strong enough, I'm told, to hold a 250-pound wizard. So if you're looking for a sturdy, secure and sleek-looking case to keep your miniatures safe, both on the go and at home, then check out the Mag Case 2.0 from Tabletop Stronghold. They're a small business based in West Virginia, but they offer free shipping to the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and most of the EU. So wherever you are, you can take advantage of my code, PETE25, and get a huge 25% off your first order. So check them out for yourself by using my link in the comments and description. A big thank you to Tabletop Stronghold. Now, let's get back to that Black Angel. When it came to picking out a weapon for my Black Angel, I opted for a sword. I did consider going for a spear, but I'd had the sword from Gilman burning a hole in my bits box for far too long. To merge the Nightbringer's arm and the flaming blade, I first had to clip away the scythe so just the hand and a little cloth remained. Once removed, the pieces were cleaned up with my knife. Then I cut away the blade and guard from the sword of Gilman's hand, followed by the pommel. After more cleanup, I repeated my earlier pinning steps to help give the sword a little more strength. Once the sword had glued to the hand, the arm was then attached to the torso. For the right arm, I decided to keep things mostly as the original kit, but those claws were looking a little too long. So after giving the Nightbringer a manicure, the right arm was also attached to the torso. The wings were a good start, but without a halo, this model wasn't quite angelic enough. Again, I sourced this component from the Gilman kit, but I did require some trimming and adjusting until it could fit over the top of the Nightbringer's hood, at which point I glued it into place. At this stage in the build, I was a little concerned that the model didn't deviate quite enough from the original and felt that a little bit of armor would help. I had this shoulder pad left over from one of my Lionel Johnson builds, which was both in the correct scale and fit nicely. I thought the sculpted on line head worked as a small nod to Sanguinious' Carcharadon pelt that he wore over the same shoulder. From here, my final tasks were to fill in a few of those gaps, hide some of the more Necron-looking details, and also add a little more divergence from the original kit. All of these were achieved with some Tamiya epoxy putty. I've started using this fairly recently instead of green stuff, and so far, it's been fantastic. I opted for the quick type, but it still gives you plenty of work time. So after cutting up and mixing a small batch, I left it to partly firm up for about 30 to 40 minutes. Once it was a little firmer, I rolled out a few cylinders and pressed these in around the robes on the back. Then, using my sculpting tools, I pressed in a series of creases and folds to replicate the blend into the cloth surrounding it. This allowed me to cover up some of the Necron markings on the back and also block in any gaps. I also used this opportunity to add a small wrap of cloth around the left arm. The removal of the scythe had left me with a random piece of robe draped over the arm. I was reluctant to fully remove it, so the extra piece of wrapped cloth just helped to cement it into place. I also used the putty to blank out the inside of the robe's hood and to sculpt on a few feathers to wear the wings during the torso. This helped to blend out an otherwise abrupt transition. After filling in the various gaps, I then took a fresh batch of putty and rolled it out flat until it was around 0.5 mm in thickness. Here it was allowed to cure for about 45 minutes to an hour. This made it much easier to cut into strips and maintain its shape, as I laid it across some paintbrushes. The putty was just soft enough to bend slightly. The brushes helped to hold the shape while it fully cured overnight. With my strips of flowing parchment complete, I could smooth out the surfaces and sharpen the edges with a little fine grit sandpaper before adding some shallow cuts and tears with my knife, resulting in that aged parchment look. These pieces were then glued to the various points across the torso, where I made sure to follow the flow of the cloth around them. At this point, I was very ready to start painting, but first I added some chunks of torn up cork to the base, followed by some Citadel skulls, before giving everything a coat of black primer. As I planned this model to be quite dark across the robes, the black primer made the most sense, but I did need to give it a coat of a regular black paint, specifically Doom Death Black from the Tooth and Coats range. The black primer has a slightly different finish and colour to the Doom Death Black. This would have meant that I couldn't easily fix any mistakes with Doom Death Black, as it would have had a slightly different, but still just about noticeable appearance. The easy workaround was to just give everything a uniform coat of Doom Death Black using my airbrush. With the black in place, I could start to add a little colour. It was quite tempting to keep this entire model as various shades of black. This will keep it in line with the descriptions found in the Darkness in the Blood novel, but again, this would have left me with something a little too similar to the base model. So, I decided to incorporate more typical Blood Angel colours, specifically the Black Rage Afflicted Death Company, and created a predominantly black scheme, but with elements of red and gold. So, armed once again with my airbrush, I thinned out a little Amphora Red and sprayed this across the ragged edges of the robes and the lightning bolts below them. I more heavily focused this application towards the bottom and applied lighter coats as I moved upwards, resulting in a gradient from the red to the black. This effect was pushed further with a brighter Emperor's Red. This time around I focused only on the bolts and the very ends of the ragged robe to create a stronger contrast between the red at the bottom and the black towards the top. While I still had my airbrush out, I decided to tackle all of the larger base coats, which included the wings. I still wanted to preserve the red and black around them though, so I used some of the masking putty to help cover up any areas that I wanted to be preserved. This allowed me to give the wings a coat of wizard grey without having to worry about overspray. Again, the novel describes black wings, but the light grey would create a better through line to Sanguinious. The wings were continued with a second coat of the lighter Carcharadon Grey. Like before, I limited my application to just the tops of the wings, where you'd expect natural light to first hit. I continued to apply the Carcharadon Grey, and once I was done, I was able to put away the airbrush and remove the masking putty. There were a few spots of the wings that I had not been able to reach though, especially those feathers closer to the torso. So I briefly returned to the Wizard Grey to fill in any missed spots. From here, I began to focus on each area of the model before moving on to the next, and the first of these were the exposed arms, legs, and torso of the Black Angel. The colour I settled on here was that of a dark gold, and I started out with some Spartan Bronze. Like the wings, I wanted this to be a subdued, darker version of both the Sanguinor and Sanguinious' gleaming gold armour. More of a dark reflection than a cast shadow. To help darken down some of the recesses, I then created a thinner mixture of Cygor Brown contrast paint and some airbrush thinner. As this was applied across the skin, it flowed into those deeper indentations and created the effect of shadows forming in them. With the wash complete, I next began the highlights. The first of these was Dragon's Gold, which was used to pick out the raised edges of the golden skin. These thin lines of brighter paint combined with the shading helped to emphasize those details. This effect was pushed even further with some small spots of glistening gold that I only applied to the sharpest and most prominent details. With the gold complete, I then returned to the red parts of the robe and gave the edges an initial highlight of Amphora Red. Like with the airbrush gradient, I only ran these highlights partway up the robe and focused them mainly towards the bottom. Finally, I then applied some more focused highlights of the brighter Centurion Red to only the lowest points and sharpest of edges. Next up, I returned to the wings and kicked things off with an all-over wash of Gryph-Charger Grey. This was thinned in the same way as the Cygor Brown, so that it only built up in the many recesses between the feathers and left behind a subtle amount of extra shading. The wash was followed up with further highlights. The first of these was Carcharadon Grey, with White Star being used as the final extreme highlight. As I mentioned earlier, I had inevitably made some overspills onto my black robes which needed to be cleaned up, so I first fixed these mistakes with a coat of Doom Death Black. Before moving on to the highlights, the first of these was a very dark grey of Death Reaper, which I followed with a slightly lighter Dungeon Stone Grey. For the strips of the parchment and the skulls that littered the base, I began with Dust Bowl, washed them all with more thin Cygor Brown, and then began the process of adding scratchy highlights of Sandstone, followed by Temple Stone. These rough lines helped to create that parchment texture across the surfaces of the paper strips. When it came to the sword, I decided to really lean into those flames that ran down one edge and give the sword a superheated metal look. And to kick this effect off, I gave the entire blade and flames a coat of Demon Red. This is a very bright red, so over the black you may find you need to apply several thin layers in order to achieve a solid red colour. The red would serve as the cooler parts of the blade, with the metal being hotter the closer to the central wires it was. To represent this effect, I took some Fanatic Orange and thinned it down with a little medium. The goal of this was similar to that of the cloak, to create a gradient of orange to red, and I achieved this by applying a thin layer, then another, and another until I had a solid orange in the center and the red towards the point. One tip of getting your layers consistency right here is that you should be applying so little paint with each layer that it should dry quickly. If you're having to wait around for several minutes for the paint to dry, you're applying too much. For the flames themselves, I only painted the orange into the recesses. The trick to getting realistic fire is to make sure you darken out as you move outwards. With the orange complete, I then repeated the previous step with some yellow flame, and this sat the closest to those central wires. I also used this yellow in some of the deepest recesses in the flames. For the brightest points, i.e. the wires themselves and the central ridge of the blade, I then applied a highlight of Sun Bleach Yellow. My final step was to add a few cooler spots to the very edge of the blade. For these points, I used the darker Berserker Red. This was applied in a scratchy manner, predominantly at the tips of the blades and tips of the flames. And with that, my flaming sword was complete. I next decided to add a little text to the strips of parchment, and for this I used a combination of Doom Death Black and Demon Red. The Demon Red was used to create some Blood Angel and Death Company iconography, and I applied thin lines of Doom Death Black to give the impression of scripture. With the mini itself complete, I turned my attention to the base and kicked things off by base coating all the rocks with Dungeonstone Grey, before applying a wash of Cygor Brown, and then highlighted them with some Wizard Grey. To fill in the gaps between all the rocks, I used some of AK Interactive's texture paste, specifically Dark Earth. This was carefully spooned onto the base where I paid close attention to not overspill onto the rocks and skulls. I then applied one final wash of Cygor Brown, before using a black marker to clean up the base, coating everything with a protective layer of matte varnish and adding a few grass tufts, which left me with this. And here we have my finished Black Angel built from the Nightbringer miniature. My goal with this build was to create something that would fit the mental image you might have if I asked you to imagine what the Black Rage would look like if it manifested into a physical entity. The flaming sword, halo, and wings provide the angelic aspect. The dark, empty hood of the robes that move into a ragged red edge references the Death Company, and those smaller, extra details help to cement the model as a Blood Angel, all of which combines to create that dark reflection of Sanguinious. If you enjoyed this guide, be sure to leave me a like and subscribe for similar builds like this. I'd also love to hear about any ideas you might have for other similar obscure characters from the background you'd like to see me tackle. Leave me those suggestions down in the comments. You can find all the kits and paints used in this video down in the description below, along with some affiliate links. I've also recently partnered with taschengelddieb.de, so if you're in Germany or any other EU country and looking for some discounted Warhammer, be sure to follow my links and use my code PETESQUAD for an extra 4% off at checkout. You can also pick up my own kits, Dead Animal Bits and Sorcerer Spoils over on my web store, thesparepartsemporium.com. Anything you buy from there is packaged up and shipped by me, and the sales go directly to supporting me and the channel. And before I go, let me, as always, say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going with their support. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button, just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Andrew Marston, Banyevrian, Berserker, Dakota Gaburi, Daniel Dowling, George Kanzini Roberts, Nightwolf, Little Templar, Matt Savitsky, Matt Mini-Minute, Sam Sepulveda, Son of Sevatar, Sweatsman, Tim, and Zeth27. And my top channel members, who are Alex Verne, Andrew Chell, Bon Johnson, Chris Toomey, Dante, Dave, Doug H, Ferdinand Richardson, Guy Bazant, Jan Gazik, John Gibbs, Kaiser Waffle 11, Lariat 11, Lewis Cleveland, Mark Taylor, Mr. Pogon, Nodington Paints, Patrick K, Philip Poyer, Ryan O'Shaughnessy, S.O., S.J. Carper, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.